Mike Michalowicz said something to the effect of, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity. And so if you're not profitable, what are you doing? What is the point? And maybe you have a J curve where you have a clear break even and then you're going to have great profitability. But that is why I love designing a plan around
Welcome back to another episode of Angels, Exits, and Acquisitions. I'm your host, Jeff Barnes. Really excited for this interview with Chris Rhyme. And we are talking about business transition, but more importantly, how do you not give up equity as a founder or CEO when you really need a great person on your team and maybe you can't afford to pay them all of their salary right now, or they're saying, hey, in order for me to get involved, I need equity. There are some incredible insights in this interview. And we're going to talk about how you can actually grow your business and practically guarantee its growth without having to give up equity by bringing in the right people. So stay tuned, listen in, and as always, like, subscribe, and share. And thanks for listening to the Angels, Exits, and Acquisitions podcast.
Welcome to Angels, Exits, and Acquisitions, the place to learn how to fund, scale, exit, and massively profit as an angel investor or entrepreneur. Brought to you by the Angel Investors Network. And now, here's your host, Jeff Barnes.
Welcome back to another episode of Angels, Exits, and Acquisitions. I'm your host, Jeff Barnes. I'm here today with Chris Rhyme. Chris, how are you doing?
Really good, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much. And I appreciate you being here. I'm really excited to be talking with you about what you guys do over at the Business Transition Group. But before we dive into all of that, why don't you give folks a brief background about who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so Denver native, born here, but spent 7 years on the West Coast. Ended up getting a law degree, then passing a bar in Colorado. Found out I loved entrepreneurship and building and selling businesses. So I spent a couple years doing investment banking, which is buying and selling companies and raising debt and equity. I was typically in the $25 to $250 million enterprise value space. And then transitioned to a family firm as my dad had spent 40 years building a wealth management firm. And then 10 years ago, started working with him, and 4 years ago started buying him out of that. And so I sort of eat my own cooking with the internal transition planning stuff and have a special emphasis on exit planning and executive compensation, which we're here to talk about today.
Absolutely. Well, wonderful. So we have a varied background, a lot of diverse stuff going on there, but primarily, like you said, around entrepreneurship, business ownership, and so on. And today we want to talk a little bit about, there's the transition piece, like you're mentioning, but more importantly, I think we want to focus in on how do you hire key executives inside of a business without giving up equity? And as a guy who consults with, advises a number of startups and helping you raise capital, this is not something I focus on with them. The question does come up from time to time, but I'm very curious how you guys landed on doing this and what your unique sauce is, if you will.
Yeah. So it does start to change a little bit. I think when all you've got is equity and blue sky and upside and hopes and dreams, then a lot of what you're selling or able to give is in fact equity. But when you start to be profitable, even at a nominal level, or grow to significant profitability, call it a couple $1 million in net income or EBITDA profit, then the sharing of that profit becomes one of the key benefits to a transaction. And so I spent the better part of 10 years figuring out how do you design an executive comp structure so that you give an employee all of the benefits of ownership financially without the burdens. And so as I've spent time thinking about this, I get down to the first order principles and have realized if you own stock in a company, usually S corporations for smaller companies, even a C corp, you're only going to get two benefits. Number one, you're going to get the right to potential future profit. So if your company is profitable and you own some of that stock and there's a distribution, then you'll get some of that. Even if it's a pass through like an S corp or an LLC tax as a partnership, that'll flow through on your K1. And the second benefit financially, the only other benefit is right to appreciation upon sale. So if you get equity grants at a very small value and then the value of the company grows and there's a sale or a liquidation disposition of the company, you might get that sort of light at the end of the tunnel. But that's it. It's future profit, if any, and capital appreciation in the stock if you end up growing and selling the company in the future.
Yeah, and let's be honest, most companies never get to an exit. And unfortunately, most companies also never really raise capital so they can scale up and start paying dividends and distributions, right? So you end up in this conundrum where it's like people really, really want equity. And let's face it, people love to call themselves a partner. They love to call themselves an owner. They love to be a founder, right? And so it's one of those things that, at least I'd say, somewhat naive and even younger potential founders, co-founders find themselves in this position. But the more mature people say, you get to that point and say, listen, I have a lot of, like me, I have a lot of equity in the graveyard. You can't eat equity, right? And so they want to be incentivized in other ways that are going to be meaningful to them now, but also in the long term, right? And so you were talking about a share of profits. How do you structure something like that so that somebody understands it and it makes sense for them financially?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. And I love that you can't eat equity. You also can't pay college tuition. And
Right.
the promises that an owner often gives to an employee, one day I'll take care of you, that's not sending your kids to college. And so you need something more tangible. And so what I've kind of designed and worked on a lot is giving people a share of the profitability, but on a long-term basis and subject to vesting. And so I dived into this world called non-qualified deferred compensation. And that's a bunch of fancy legal language that basically says it's not qualified. So we're not talking about an IRA or a 401k. Those would be forms of qualified plans under all of ERISA and subject to the restrictions, very specific. And one of the challenges there is you cannot discriminate, meaning all employees get the same benefit. And what we're talking about is how do you give somebody a specific benefit if they're an executive manager, their P&L important, and if they leave, you're going to feel it on the bottom line. Those are the critical people you want to think about for these long-term incentive plans that are going to be with you for years, maybe the duration of your company existence. And so what I've really drilled down on is non-qualified deferred compensation plans. You can call it a long-term incentive plan or an executive management plan. But the idea is how do you share some of the profitability over time, make it subject to vesting, and then give them a real benefit. And so many of your listeners have probably heard of things like phantom stock or stock appreciation rights, which are forms of what are called synthetic equity or sort of fake equity, but it mirrors or tracks the actual value of the company. The hard part about that is if you're in a closely held business, the value of what that company is worth is all over the map. And so it's sort of like giving you a gold Cougaran, and you may not know what that's worth. And so it's not that valuable. But if I give you a dollar denominated award and say, hey, here's 50 American dollars, you say, I know what that's worth. And so I like to design plans that allow us to drive enterprise value by giving people specific dollar denominated awards based on performance so that they know what they're actually getting, how it vests, and when they get their money.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack right there. That's a lot of great information. And it makes sense, right? If they understand what the value of their award reward is, then it's easier for them to grasp the meaning of that. But let's start with you said a term, and I want people to understand what that term means, which is closely held business. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So closely held would be in contrast to publicly traded. So Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, these are publicly traded companies where today I can go online and buy shares and be a tiny owner of that company. If you buy shares of Berkshire Hathaway, you can go to their annual conference in Omaha. But a privately held business means the stock is closely concentrated in a small group of people. So most businesses in the United States under a certain revenue threshold are generally closely held, meaning there are 2 or 3 or 4, maybe 10 owners. Some engineering firms have 100 owners that each own a small percentage, but they're still closely held, meaning that stock is not liquid and readily available on a third-party market.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for people to understand is it's not liquid, right?
That's it.
So again, going back to it in the sense of I want equity in the company. Great. Well, guess what? The founder never planned on selling, right? And even when they decide to die off later on, they may not even have a transition plan, like you kind of alluded to. And so as a result, that stock is really worth the paper it's written on in a lot of cases, right? And so because of that, because it's a closely held business, because it's a private business, you also can't take those shares and go sell it, right? You can't just like leave the company and say, oh, well, I'm going to go sell these shares because they're all worth $1 and I have 100,000 of them. So I'll do that, right? There's no market for that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And a good question to ask is if you think you're an employee who wants ownership Ask your owner, how many times have you sold your stock? Almost always, the answer is zero.
Yeah.
They might have one transaction. There are serial entrepreneurs that have multiple, but they're few and far between. And you, as an employee, are not in control. So if you had the certainty of a specific dollar amount over the fickleness of a potential sale, if I were you, I would take the certainty of a dollar amount every day.
Now, how does this work for, let's just say, early stage startups? Right? I can see the appeal when we're talking about companies have been around for a while. They're already generating revenue. There is profitability, so they know what they're going to get. But what about earlier stage companies that are going out there and they're raising their seed round or their Series A, and they're not to profitability? Some of them not even making generating any revenue yet. What's the conversation you have with some of those folks?
Yeah, it's certainly more challenging in that standpoint. I mean, you can define a deferred compensation plan that's going to share profit once you get there. And so that contractually puts in place the sharing arrangement when the company becomes profitable, but you can't share profit if you don't have it. And so typically that's sort of aspirational if you're a very young startup with limited revenue or profit.
Yeah, and so from that standpoint, again, that's where this whole thing comes from. Is that the only bargaining chip you really have is equity, right? Because you don't have any revenue, you haven't raised money yet, and so on. And so I've seen a number of times where people will say, "Okay, we will tie your compensation to once we've raised capital, then we can, give you compensation." But what about the legal ramifications around that? Are there any legal ramifications to a deferred compensation plan? And if so, how do you guys help with that?
Yeah. So I just play a lawyer on TV. I did go to law school, but I'm not actively practicing law. So this is not legal advice. But um, the interesting thing about non-qualified plans is that they are funded with after-tax dollars, and then the company gets a deduction if and when they pay out the benefit, which is called a triggering event. And so um, the big issue that needs to be discussed with both sides, the employer and the employee, is what's called the substantial risk of forfeiture. And that is if the company goes bankrupt and you were promised a bunch of money in a deferred compensation plan, you will be a creditor standing in line trying to collect that. And so if revenue and profitability is a fragile thing in a startup company, you need to sort of consider that more heavily if you're the employee that's being promised future awards because you're not sure they're going to be there. So the substantial risk of forfeiture is a big issue to contend with. Now, the benefit is that means it's not taxable to the employee when it's awarded. So that promise is not going to incur income tax right then. But on the back end, when it pays out, it will be received as ordinary income for that employee.
Well, that's good to know because, especially in C Corps, there's a double taxation, right? You get taxed on at the corporate level, you get taxed on the individual level on the dividend side. But obviously, you guys help with that, making sure that it's set up in a way that they wouldn't end up having to incur additional income tax, right?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned C Corps, Jeff, because deferred compensation can be very beneficial for high income earning entrepreneurs because if they have that 21% income tax, the deferred comp obligation hits at the corporate level or 21% and not their ordinary income bracket, which might be 37% federal plus up to 13% state if they're in California. So then you've got a differential between 21 and 50% of being able to fund or deduct this obligation. So C Corps can be some of the best for these structures.
That's good to know because I think that a lot of folks, when you're an entrepreneur, when you're a startup, when you're an early stage company, just a regular old small business owner who, might have bought a brick and mortar company, whether it's an ice cream shop or a dry cleaner, things like that. That is not what's going through their mind is, the tax ramifications, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people will think about it, but we have found that the vast majority don't even think about tax issues until they get hit with a tax bill.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say that's one of the biggest issues with ownership. And that is key people want ownership, but they don't even know what a K1 is. So if you're an S Corp or a partnership and all of a sudden you have imputed income through a K1, but you didn't get a distribution to pay tax, you're like, this was not what I wanted. I wanted more money. I did not want tax
Right.
headaches. And so these plans that we're talking about, I think, give a lot of the benefits without some of the burdens of ownership.
Before continuing, please subscribe and share this video to help us reach more people and stay notified of our latest releases. Now, let's continue watching and learning.
That's really important. I think imputed income. Let's talk about that. I've been investing in the past where we have imputed interest, right? because you're trying to negotiate a really big deal with like a 0% loan, but the IRS doesn't care about that. They still want their cake, right? So, phantom income can still be taxed, right?
Yeah, and I think the accurate way to think about it is if an S corp is a bucket with a hole in the bottom, then the profitability is just going to flow right down onto your K1 in your proportionate ownership. So if your company made $100,000 and you own 50% of an S corp, you're going to get a K1 for $50,000, but that does not mean that the company gave you that money. So you get a tax bill as if you got $50,000 of cash. You might not have any. And so that is one of the greatest mismatches of expectations of ownership versus reality. And then the timing of that can be really challenging. And so, and for the owner, a lot of times they've reinvested that money over time. And so by the time the tax bill comes, that money's already spent on new hires or working capital or new inventory or whatever they needed. And so there's not even money in the bank account and they have a tax bill and their key people are saying, hey, I need money for taxes. And again, you're getting these burdens of ownership that you had no idea about because you didn't understand entity taxation, which is a pretty nerdy area.
Yeah, yes, it is. Absolutely. It's definitely a specialty field. And, another specialty field is corporate governance, right? And given what you guys do, I'm assuming you've had conversations with founders, owners about this, which is once you start giving up equity to somebody, sometimes there is an issue. And this actually happened to me. I sat on the board of a company that I founded, and we had two partners, gave them equity. I'm the one that put up all the money, came up with original ideas. I just needed them for a strategic partnership. I actually got voted out of my own company because eventually we had a disagreement. We had something happen. And I look back and I say it was one of the dumbest mistakes in my career. Should have seen the writing on the wall. I didn't. And so I ended up with a situation where I lost $250,000 and I lost the business and I lost the upside. And of course, they drove the business in the ground and disappeared altogether. So do you ever have conversations with the founders about the corporate governance side and board seats and how shareholders can actually play a pivotal role in the growth of a company?
All the time. And the starting point is giving equity, whether it's 1% or 100%, giving equity to another person is like getting married before no fault divorce, meaning the law treats you at a higher standard as if you got married than if you actually legally got married to somebody, because it's easier to get divorced and cite irreconcilable differences than it is to break up a business partnership because you owe your partners fiduciary duties. And so in a non-qualified deferred comp plan, you are not bringing on partners who you owe fiduciary duties to. You owe contractual duties under your non-qualified plan, but you don't owe the same fiduciary duties of care, good faith, and loyalty. And so it's a very different arrangement. And to your point, I've seen case after case after case where an owner gave 5, 10, 15% of the company thinking that would help grow the enterprise value and really give ownership. And it didn't accomplish that. And then they went to get it back. They had to litigate for value. They had to buy it back for more than it was worth, or they had giant legal bills to kind of remedy that or whatever. So you can create corporate documentation to protect you a little bit against that. But at the end of the day, I ask the question, if you're trying to give the financial benefits of ownership without the burdens, why give equity at all if you can give them some of the profit on a long-term basis and the capital appreciation if there's a sale? Because then you get the best of both worlds. And as an owner, you're not asking for permission to open bank accounts or running into other issues
Right.
with recourse debt or any plethora of issues where you want to make decisions quickly as a small company that owns all the stock. You get to call the shots. And so you get to maintain some of the control instead of unintentionally giving that to a minority stakeholder.
Yeah. And I'd imagine you guys have some stories about times that people maybe gave up equity and probably shouldn't have. Can you give us any examples of those?
Yeah, I have one client who thought that they needed a really high level CFO, and so they gave about 10% of the company day one when this person came on. And so
No vesting or anything, huh?
yeah, at the very least, if you're going to do that, add vesting, add performance metrics, like add something. Don't just give it to them. And they didn't establish buyback value, and so it was probably a $200,000 share in the company, and they ended up buying it back for $600,000, and they spent legal fees litigating over value. And so you certainly want to begin with the end in mind and think through what happens if we end up parting ways. How do you get that equity back? And issues like, what if I sell? What if we bring on other partners? All those things need to be thought of in advance.
So, I'm actually going through this with one of my clients right now, and they're looking to bring on a C-suite executive in the company, and revenue is not to a place where they're profitable and can actually pay the executive. And so the conversation is around um, KPIs, key performance indicators, benchmarks that have to be achieved, vesting with cliffs, and all of these different things that go into it. But really, because this is a tech company and the goal is an IPO or an M&A or an acquisition in the future, the whole intent is we want to get to a liquidity event. That's where you're going to make your money, right? And the C-suite, the prospect knows this. They know that that's the goal.
Yep.
At the end of the rainbow is get to that point. But with what you were just saying, I see a lot of challenges with doing it and making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And the other piece I could see is when you go to somebody like that and they know that the value is in the exit, really, and maybe they'll make some salary along the way, but they'll be willing to defer most of that until the exit's plan. 3-5 years, who knows? How do you have those conversations? And if you are able to navigate, hey, we don't want to give up equity, is there a way to defer it all the way to the end, to when the gold is at the end of the rainbow?
This is more creative thinking out loud than structures I've worked in the past, because most of my clients are successfully and profitably operating and have a track record. But I do wonder about adding a non-qualified piece that is then going to tie to the value of exit. So they're going to get a piece of that as they help build it. So there is going to be the same vesting component, a deferred piece of that, and then it's going to be benchmarked instead of off dollars, off of a transition value. And so I think that's certainly something to consider. And there you're getting more into the quasi-equity world itself. But it's challenging to get to revenue and profitable levels that are sort of sustainable, for sure. That's
Yeah.
a big challenge.
Well, and even to that point, let's just say, okay, we're not going to try and defer everything to the end, and we want to pay you a percentage of profits based off of your role. But how do you encourage them to get there, right? Like a lot of people want to grow the top line. Let's be honest. Most people, when they think about business, are like, oh yeah, I do $100 million. But how much did you make? Well, we actually lost $5 million last year, right? It's hard to pay out people when you're not profitable. So what kind of key metrics do you guys look at to help people grow both the profitability and thus the enterprise value of a business?
Yeah, that's the bajillion-dollar question. Mike Michalowicz said something to the effect of, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity. And so if you're not profitable, what are you doing? What is the point? And maybe you have a J curve where you have a clear break even and then you're going to have great profitability. But that is why I love designing a plan around EBITDA or profit percentage metrics, because if there is profit, I know we're going to have money with which to fund a non-qualified plan. If you use revenue or top line revenue growth, then you might grow tremendously. You could double the size of your company in terms of top line and lose money and have to make a big award under a plan like this. And so by far, my favorite is profitability or a percentage of profitability. And I'll give you a couple examples that have put some meat on those bones. I worked with a client that said, at a minimum, we should be at 10% net income margins. Everything above that, I'll take 50% of the ups and put it in a pool for these key executives, these 13 people. So you can design a metric like that, and there can be a gate of a minimum level of profitability. And revenue can be a component, because especially if you're in software as a service or you're in this recurring revenue model, you do want to grow your annually recurring revenue. And so you can incentivize that, but there has to be a minimum level of profitability. Otherwise, there's no money to fund this plan with. And then you're just building this giant liability for the hoped for sale. And I do not recommend that. And so using profitability in some fashion is one of my favorites. I also really like triangulating awards. If you're going to do a plan like this, at 15 to 30% of an annual salary compensation level for people, because once you add vesting on top of it, if it's not substantial enough to be 15 to 30% of their comp, then it's probably not big enough to get them to think twice about leaving the company. And the retentive aspect is significant when you add the vesting on top.
Okay, so that's a really important piece to touch on, right? Which is you would only do this, I'm assuming, in the case where you're like, listen, I know, like if I was to say, Chris, I need you in my company. I want you to work with me. I want to be part of this. The only reason I'd even be willing to do this and offer 15 to 30% of total comp from profits, because I know you can really drive results, right? And I think that's a really, really key important piece. It's not just because, oh, I'd like to hire you, but I can't afford your full salary.
Yes.
It's, I know that you're going to add value. I mean, is that spot on right there?
That nails it, Jeff, because the best way to think about this is if the metrics are designed properly, for every dollar of value that you award me, I'm going to create $5 to $10 of enterprise value growth for you. And so that's a good trade. And it makes sense because if you're going to sell your company one day for 4, 8, 10 times EBITDA and I'm growing the bottom line, then yeah, you give most of that year's dollar to me or half or whatever the percentage. But then I just created a multiple 5, 10 times that much value in the form of enterprise value for you. And so in that sense, it's a really good arrangement to get me short term to really row hard towards growing the value and awarding me fairly for it, but creating tremendous enterprise value on the back end. The other way I like to say it is, unlike a 401k, which is a cost, you have to fund that whether or not you had a good or a bad year. Your 401k, if you did like a safe harbor match, you're putting money in to match your employees whether or not you were profitable. This plan is not an expense. It is a driver of enterprise value, meaning if we had a terrible year, nobody's getting anything. There's a bunch of donuts going in for that year. If we grew and we hit our metrics, then everybody's getting a handsome award that they're going to vest in over time.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So along those lines, and this might be a little bit of a curveball for you, but in order for this to even make sense, we determined that we want to grow the business. We have to hire somebody. That person wants to have equity because they just think the equity is the best thing. But we don't want to give up equity because we don't really want to give up control and ownership of the business. But we do want them, and we'll structure a plan that's lucrative for both of us because we know they're going to drive the value. How do you counsel somebody to make sure they're bringing on the right person? And I know you're not playing counselor or HR person or lawyer here, but I got to imagine that's a part of the conversation, right? Because some people might hear about this and go, oh, well, I can just hire whoever I want now and offer to pay the profits. But that's not really what you want to do, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right, Jeff. You certainly don't want to just throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. What's interesting in my experience about these plans is that if you put 6 to 12 executives in a plan like this and you give them metrics and you show them this is where the golden ring is, and I'm going to let you put your hands on the steering wheel of your own compensation, you're going to see who drives it to where they want to go and who acts like it's an accident when they run into a tree. And by that, I mean, there are people that are going to lean forward and go after this hard, and they're going to like the performance piece of it. And they're quasi owners. They're people that think about enterprise value growth. And then there's people that shirk back from the responsibility and the accountability of hitting performance metrics. And those are the people that are showing you by their actions that they're probably not a great fit and they just wanted a high salary. And so sometimes the proof is in the pudding of how these plans work out. Now, the benefit I mentioned is there's a vesting period. And so if somebody is really doing a bad job and you let them go, they might only get 20 or 40% of 1 year's award. So you're not out that much. If they stuck around and did a great job, they get all their money. But if they did a terrible job, you're not coming out of pocket too much, especially if you have a multiple year payout when they leave. It really smooths out the cash flow and allows you to be pretty generous or flexible with the awards and then the payouts.
Yeah, I really like that. And you're right. If you put a plan like this, I'm assuming you guys help them build that kind of plan, that structure, right?
Yep.
That's exactly what you guys do. So once you put this in front of the right person, we say this regularly, and I found this out to be so true. A players hire A players, right? They want to be surrounded by the best, the brightest, the guys and gals that are going to go for it. But B players hire C and D players because they're afraid of them taking their jobs or stepping on their toes or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And I don't want to sound like a total pessimist here, but I have seen a lot of small business owners who are B players, right?
Definitely.
They don't really have the growth mindset. They're not really trying to improve their operations on a regular basis. They're not really trying to improve profitability. They like having a business that pays their bills, but they're still going to complain about a lot of things instead of just fixing them, right? And so I'd imagine this only makes sense when you are a growth-oriented business owner, founder, who wants to take this company to the next level, and you need to have the right people on. And as a result, when you put this plan in front of the right people, the B's, C's, D's players will say, nope, that's too much work and too much responsibility. And how dare you tell me that I only get paid what I'm worth once I prove it? Gosh, what a weird concept, right? But the A players will gravitate towards us, I imagine.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the only carve out to that, or the caveat, is sometimes you have very mediocre business owners who sometimes are very humble, hardworking people, but not the most sophisticated. And they end up getting really talented people. And they know, they just get this gut intuition that they need to do something to keep these people, but they don't know how. And so that is another great application for this, where they all of a sudden have an ops manager that's basically doing their job and making them really profitable, and they're growing. And they go, I know this is good and I don't know how to keep this person. And so very, very commonly I get engagements because a business owner makes a promise to keep people and says, I'm gonna give you equity, or I'm gonna take care of you, or I'm gonna put a long-term plan in place to give you more money, or I'm gonna do something to really make it right with you. And then they don't know how to do that. So they commit sort of that verbal suicide in a sense. And then they come to me and they go, hey, can you help me keep that promise that I just made? And that's where I find a lot of opportunity for folks.
No, that's really important too. And I think it goes back also to you're exactly right. There are people that I have found, I'm just surprised they're even in business,
Yeah.
let alone as successful as they are. And I think it just comes down to they're really good at surrounding themselves with the right people.
Yes.
I've actually found that to be 99% of the time. They're actually just really good at surrounding themselves with the right people.
Yep.
But let's talk just briefly. I know we're kind of at the end of time here, but when we're talking about transitions, and I'd imagine there's some people in your guys' portfolio, your client base, who are like, listen, I'm getting to the age where I want to pull back and I want to retire. I don't want to have to work 5-7 days a week, 16 hours a day anymore.
Yep.
But they don't want to see it die and they don't want to sell it.
Yep.
Right. They're in this phase with like, listen, I'm not ready to, ride off into the sunset, but I don't want to just like get rid of the whole thing altogether either. And just retire or hand it off to my kids or whatever that case may be. Like you're going through this as the one who's acquiring the business.
Yep.
Can you structure this, or do you guys use this as a tool to try and bring in a management team to create a legacy business that will continue to thrive without the founder or the owner?
Totally. So let me give you 2 case studies as we wrap up. One would be where you have an owner that has a potential son or daughter they want in the business, who's young enough that they don't know if they're going to like it, lean forward, and have the skill set, aptitude, and ability to lead the company. So in the interim, call it 10 years between when mom or dad is ready to get out and son or daughter is ready to come in, you can put a non-qualified plan in place to compensate people as if they were owners, while you preserve the equity for that next generation, and you take care of the management team so the company doesn't fall to shambles before it gets to the next generation. That's one case study. The second case study is in transition. It's not uncommon where you've got different ages of successor owners. So if you have a 50-year-old, they don't have time to spend 10 to 15 years buying the company from the departing owner and then turn around and sell it over 10 to 15 years. And so maybe they have a younger junior counterpart who's 35 and does have the time. Well, then you put a non-qualified deferred comp plan in place for the 50-year-old, and you actually transition equity alongside that to the younger successor owner. So you can be really creative in how you structure this.
That's awesome, Chris. This is great, very insightful, because even coming into this call, I'm thinking, okay, well, what are ways, we've given percentage of profits, we've given royalties and licensing fees and things like that, but it's not always tied to performance metrics and being able to tie it to a growth plan, because let's face it, if you're not growing, you're dying in a lot of businesses, right? Because somebody's going to eat your lunch eventually.
That's it.
So, this has been great, Chris. Why don't you tell folks where they can find out more about you and how they can connect with you?
Yeah. So I'm at C Rhyme, just like Buster Rhyme, RHYME, at thebusinesstransitiongroup.com. And you can email me anytime, find us on the web. Certainly love to talk to anybody interested. Thank you, Jeff, for the time.
Absolutely. A real pleasure. And we'll make sure we have your website and LinkedIn and email and all that sort of stuff on the show notes. So if you guys are listening to this or watching it, make sure you go check out the show notes, because we'll have all that information there and handy so you can reach out to Chris. This has been the Angels, Exits, and Acquisitions podcast. I'm here with Chris Rhyme from the Business Transition Group. Chris, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks, Jeff.